For almost the whole of human history, being a baby was the most dangerous thing a person could do. Roughly 1 in every 4 babies died before their first birthday. Half of all children never reached the age of 5. Not in some terrible plague year. Every single year. That was simply normal. No formula, no clean water, no medicine, no fridge, not even the knowledge that germs exist. And yet, somehow our ancestors kept their babies alive for 200,000 years. So how on earth did they do it? That is exactly what this video is about. We are going to travel through time from an Ice Age cave all the way to the bottle in your kitchen, and at every single stop, we will ask the same questions. How many babies survived? How many mothers survived giving birth? What did the babies actually eat? What did they use before nappies? And what was the one thing most likely to kill them? The answers are tender, strange, sometimes horrifying, and they end with you, because every single person watching this is the final link in a chain of survival that never once broke, across 10,000 generations. Let us go back to the very beginning. Picture a small band of humans in the deep past, 20,000 years ago. No houses, no farms, no village, just a family group moving across the land, and somewhere in the middle of them, wrapped in soft animal skin and held against a warm body, a newborn baby. This baby was born into a world with no doctors and no medicine, yet in some ways it was safer here than it would be for the next 10,000 years. Roughly 70% of these babies made it to their first birthday, and only about half reached the age of 5. The mother almost always survived the birth itself, somewhere around 98 or 99 times out of 100, because births were spaced years apart, and the women of the band knew exactly what to do. If you made it through childhood, you could expect to live into your 40s or 50s. It was only the staggering number of baby deaths that dragged the average lifespan down to around 30. So what did this baby eat? One thing and one thing only: breast milk, and not for a few months, but for years. Ice Age mothers nursed their children until they were 2, 3, even 4 years old. There was no other safe option, and that long, slow nursing did something clever. It naturally spaced out births so a mother had one small child to carry and protect at a time, not 5. There were no nappies. In the warm regions where our species was born, babies were often simply held, and the mother learned to read the small signals and hold the baby away from her body at the right moment. Out in the cold, soft moss, dry grass, and supple animal skins did the job, tucked around the baby and changed when soiled. Moss was the wet wipe of the Stone Age. Soft and surprisingly absorbent, the baby was almost never put down. It was carried everywhere in a sling of hide, pressed skin to skin, kept warm by the body and the fire. At night, the whole group slept close together, and that closeness was a survival tool because the greatest dangers were cold, infection, and the predators waiting in the dark. Try to imagine one ordinary night for this family. The fire is low, the air is cold, and the new mother lies curled around her baby with 2 or 3 other women close by. The baby wakes to feed again and again through the night, and that constant nursing is not just food, it is warmth, comfort, and medicine all at once. A grandmother, one of the rare humans who lived long enough to have grey hair, takes the baby for an hour so the mother can sleep. This is the real secret weapon of our species, and scientists have a name for it: alloparenting, the sharing of childcare across the whole group. A human baby is born more helpless than any other animal on Earth, unable to cling, unable to walk, useless for years. No single mother could have raised it alone in this world. It took the band, the aunts, the older children, and above all, the grandmothers. The cruel truth was that one bad day could still end everything: a fever, a fall, a hard winter, a mother who died and left a baby with no one to nurse it. And yet, against all of that, most of these babies lived, carried through the cold on the warmth and the watchfulness of the people around them. When a baby was born, the mother was helped by the older, experienced women of the band, never alone. And here is something quietly heartbreaking. In many early cultures, a baby was not truly named, not fully welcomed as a person, until it had survived those first dangerous weeks. When so many newborns slipped away, A name was a thing you earned by living. So what was most likely to kill an Ice Age baby? Infection, the cold, a difficult birth, and most of all the dangerous moment of weaning, when a child first moved off pure breast milk and onto the food and water of the adult world. The single greatest invention keeping these babies alive was not a tool at all. It was the group. Many hands, many watchful eyes, grandmothers who helped carry and feed, an entire band devoted to protecting one small life. And then humans did something that changed everything, and strangely made it harder to be a baby. They stopped wandering, they settled down, and they started to farm. About 10,000 years ago, humans learned to plant seeds and keep animals, and they stopped moving. They built the first villages, packed full of people living side by side. It was the dawn of civilization. It was also, for babies, the beginning of a quiet catastrophe. You would think that settling down with a steady food supply would make babies safer. It did the opposite. The survival odds for a newborn actually got worse. Crowding hundreds of people together with their animals, their waste, and their shared water created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Roughly 70 to 75% of babies survived their first year. But in these filthy early towns, getting to the age of 5 was a brutal gamble that about half of all children lost. Mothers still survived their births at about the same rate as before, around 98 or 99 times in 100, but they were now having far more children. With farming came food enough to feed bigger families, and a settled mother might give birth 6, 7, 8 times in her life. The population began to explode, not because babies were safer, but because so many more were being born. The food is where things went truly wrong. Babies still drank their mother's milk, but now mothers began to wean them earlier, often by 2 or 3 years old, and they introduced something new and deadly, a soft mush of grain and water, an early cereal pap, and sometimes the milk of their newly tamed cows and goats. To us, that sounds sensible. In a world with no clean water and no idea that germs existed, it was lethal. The moment a baby came off pure breast milk and onto contaminated gruel and animal milk, it was exposed to a wave of stomach infections. That is why the #1 killer here was diarrheal disease. A baby with severe diarrhea in a world with no way to replace lost fluids could die in a day or two, and it struck hardest at exactly the moment of weaning. For nappies, these early villagers used scraps of cloth, straw, and moss, and this is roughly when the practice of swaddling, wrapping a baby tightly in bands of cloth, really took hold. Babies slept close to their families in smoky huts and were carried while mothers worked the fields. Births were managed by the women of the village. And the great new tool of the age, the thing that let more babies survive even in the filth, was the backup food itself, the milk of domestic animals and the first simple pottery vessels to hold it. It was a double-edged gift, food when the mother had none, but a frequent path to deadly infection. From the first mud brick villages, we now move into the age of the first great empires, where for the first time we have writing, and people actually recorded how they cared for their babies. We are going to ancient Greece. In the city-states of ancient Greece, around 500 years before Christ, we finally have people writing things down, and what they wrote about babies is a mix of careful tenderness and cold calculation. The odds had not really improved. About 70 to 75% of Greek babies survived their first year, and only around half reached adulthood. Mothers faced childbirth with no pain relief and no understanding of infection, and while most survived any single birth, somewhere around 97 to 99 times in 100, the danger added up with every child. Bleeding and fever after birth were the great threats. If a Greek survived childhood, they might live into their 50s, but the average life expectancy at birth still hovered around 25 to 35, dragged down by all those lost children. Greek babies were fed on breast milk, usually for 2 to 3 years. But here a new social habit appears that will follow us for centuries. The wealthy did not always nurse their own children. They hired a wet nurse, another woman, often a slave, to breastfeed the baby for them. Greek doctors even wrote guidelines on how to choose a good one, and those guidelines were strangely specific. A good wet nurse, the doctors wrote, should be a healthy woman in her prime, of calm and good character, neither too young nor too old, because the Greeks believed her milk carried not just nourishment, but her very temperament into the child. A baby fed by an angry or a drunken nurse, they feared, would drink in those flaws along with the milk. It sounds like pure superstition, but underneath it lay a real and desperate truth, that the choice of who fed your baby was quite literally a choice between life and death. The poorest mothers had no such choice at all. They nursed their own babies and prayed, and when their milk failed, they reached for whatever they had, a little honey on the lips to soothe a crying child, a drop of watered wine to help it sleep. We now know that honey can carry a toxin that is deadly to infants, and that alcohol is poison to a tiny body, so some of the very things a loving parent did to comfort a baby were quietly killing it. In a world with no understanding of why babies died, every act of care was a gamble taken in the dark. Babies were wrapped in swaddling bands and laid in cradles. The birth was handled by a midwife known as a Maya, helped by female relatives, and the naming was a formal public thing. Around the 7th to 10th day after birth, a Greek family held a ceremony, running around the household hearth with the newborn, and only then was the child named and accepted into the family. Again, the name came after the most dangerous days had passed. But ancient Greece also had a dark practice we cannot ignore. A newborn that was unwanted, or sickly, or simply one mouth too many, could be legally abandoned, left exposed outside the city to die, or to be taken by strangers. The decision of whether a baby lived at all could rest entirely with the father. It is a brutal reminder of how cheap a new life could be when so few survived. The number one killer remained infectious and diarrheal disease, striking hardest around weaning, and the great breakthrough of the age was knowledge itself. For the first time, doctors were writing down real, rational advice about pregnancy, birth, and infant care, the very first baby manuals in history. We now follow that thread to the people who turned it into a science. We are going to Rome. 2,000 years ago, Rome ruled the Western world, and a Roman baby was born into the most organized, most documented childhood the world had yet seen. And yet the dying went on. The numbers are sobering. Roughly 70 to 75% of Roman babies reached their first birthday, but only about half made it to the age of 10. Mothers usually survived a given birth around 97 to 99 times in 100, but Roman women married young and had many children, so the lifetime risk was high, and death in childbirth was common enough that it haunted every pregnancy. The average life expectancy at birth was only around 25 to 35, but if a Roman lived past those deadly early years, reaching the age of 10, they could very reasonably expect to see their 50s. Roman babies drank breast milk, and the Romans had strong opinions about it. A famous doctor named Cyrannus wrote a whole manual on the subject, advising that babies nurse for about 2 years and start soft solid food at around 6 months. But wealthy Roman families, like the Greeks, routinely handed their newborns to wet nurses, hired under written contracts that specified exactly how the baby was to be fed and cared for, and a Roman birth carried one more ritual that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with fate. When a baby was born, it was placed on the ground at the father's feet. If he bent down and lifted it up, he was accepting the child into the family, and it would live. If he turned away and left it lying there, the baby was rejected, to be exposed and abandoned. The power of life and death over a newborn rested, by law and custom, in that single gesture. Picture the mother, exhausted from labour, watching to see whether her husband would reach down and raise their child. Even once accepted, the dangers crowded in. The swaddled baby was sometimes rubbed with salt and bound so tightly it could barely move, in the belief this would shape its limbs. And in the marshy lands around Rome, mosquitoes carried malaria, a fever that swept away babies and pregnant women in waves. For all of Rome's roads, laws, and engineering genius, a Roman baby still lived or died on ritual, luck, and the cleanliness of milk that no one yet knew to question. Babies were swaddled tightly and laid in cradles. Births were managed by a professional midwife, the obstetrix, and the Romans had a precise naming ritual called the Dies Lustricus, the day of purification. A baby girl was named on the 8th day after birth, a boy on the 9th. Before that day, in a society where so many newborns died within a week, the child was barely acknowledged as a person. For all their famous plumbing and bathhouses, Roman babies still died in droves, and the killers were the same. Infectious and diarrheal disease, made worse in parts of Italy by malaria. And like the Greeks, the Romans practiced the exposure of unwanted infants, leaving them at the base of a column or on a rubbish heap, where some were rescued and raised as slaves. The breakthrough of the Roman age was that manual by Soranus, a calm, rational, surprisingly modern guide to caring for a newborn that would be copied and used for over 1,000 years. Then Rome fell, and Europe slid backwards into a darker, harder time for mothers and babies alike. We are going to the Middle Ages. 1,000 years ago in medieval Europe, being born was a profoundly dangerous act, wrapped in faith, fear, and superstition. The survival odds had barely moved in thousands of years. Around 70 to 75% of medieval babies survived their first year, and only about half reached adulthood. Even the children of kings and queens died at this rate, with no medicine that could save them. Mothers usually survived any single birth, somewhere around 98 or 99 times in 100, though noble records suggest a real and frightening risk that climbed with every child. Childbirth was so feared that women often prepared their souls for death before going into labour. Life expectancy at birth sat around 30 to 35 years. Medieval babies were breastfed for about 2 years, and weaning was often guided by the appearance of the first teeth, the sign a child could chew real food. When breast milk was not available, babies were given pap, a mush of bread soaked in water or milk, and caudle, a warm mixture of ale, bread and eggs. Even small beer, very weak ale, was given to babies, because everyone knew the water could kill you. Animal milk was used only in emergencies, usually in the orphanages where motherless babies were sent. Babies were swaddled very tightly, bound up like little parcels in the belief it would help their limbs grow straight, and laid in wooden cradles. They slept beside their parents, which carried its own quiet danger, the risk of a sleeping adult rolling onto and smothering the baby, something the church actually issued warnings about. A medieval birth was a women-only ritual, heavy with fear and faith. The room was darkened and kept warm, holy relics and charms were brought in, and prayers were said to Saint Margaret, the protector of women in labour. The midwife stood ready, if the baby seemed likely to die, to perform an emergency baptism on the spot, so the soul would be saved even if the body was lost. People believed that unbaptized babies who died became restless spirits, and that fairies might steal a beautiful newborn and leave a sickly changeling in its place, a folk explanation for the heartbreaking way a healthy baby could suddenly weaken and fade. Behind the superstition was simply the terror of a world where a child could be lost overnight for no reason anyone could see. And the food carried its own hidden danger, because the pap and caudle fed to babies were prepared with dirty hands, dirty water and dirty cloth. So the same diseases that ran through the village ran straight into the smallest, weakest bodies. To be a baby in the Middle Ages was to be loved fiercely and lost easily. Births were managed entirely by midwives and the women of the household. No man was allowed in the room. And because the church taught that an unbaptized baby could not enter heaven, and because so many died within days, babies were baptized and named as fast as possible, often within a day or two of birth. The fear of a child dying with no name and no soul saved was very real. The number one killer was the same relentless enemy: diarrhea and dysentery, fevers and chest infections, and the dangerous habit of the age, beyond the suffocating swaddling, was that wealthy families still sent their babies away to live with a wet nurse, out of sight, where they died at even higher rates. The breakthrough, such as it was, came from the monasteries and the church, which organised midwifery and pushed for rapid baptism, and kept alive the old Roman medical writings. From the medieval world we step into a time of explorers, printing presses and kings, the Renaissance. 500 years ago, in the age of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the world was changing fast. Art, science and exploration were exploding. But in the nursery, almost nothing had improved. A baby in 1500 faced the same grim odds as a baby in the Stone Age. About 70 to 75% survived the first year, and only half reached adulthood. This was true even for royalty. Queens watched baby after baby die. Mothers survived most individual births, around 98 or 99 in 100. But with families of 6 or 7 children, and with the ever-present threat of fever after birth, many women still died bringing life into the world. Life expectancy at birth was around 30 to 40 years. The food followed the old pattern. Mothers nursed for around 1.5 to 2 years, while the rich handed their babies to wet nurses. When breast milk failed, it was pap and caudle again, bread and grain mushes that filled the belly but carried infection. Babies were dressed in swaddling and linen cloths, the cloths that served as nappies known as clouts. Births were still the domain of women, now with midwives who were often licensed by the church. Babies were baptized and named within days, and the dangerous fashion of the wealthy continued and even grew, sending newborns out of the city to live with a country wet nurse for the first year or two of life, a separation that raised the chance the baby would die. The killers were smallpox, plague, fevers, and the endless diarrhea. But there was one genuinely new thing in this age, and it would slowly change everything: the printing press. For the first time, printed books on midwifery and the care of children spread across Europe, putting advice into the hands of ordinary midwives and mothers. Knowledge could now travel faster than ever before. That knowledge was about to collide with a strange and tragic new idea about how to feed a baby without its mother. We are going to the 1700s. In the 1700s, the age of Mozart and grand cities, society tried, for the first time on a large scale, to solve the problem of the motherless baby. And it went horribly wrong. For ordinary families, the odds were creeping upward at last. Perhaps 75 to 80% of babies survived their first year. But this is also the era of a dark experiment. Great cities built foundling hospitals, huge institutions to take in abandoned and orphaned babies, and inside their walls, the death rate was catastrophic. In some foundling homes, the majority of babies admitted did not survive. Mothers giving birth survived around 98 or 99 times in 100, and the lifetime risk of dying in childbirth across this era was roughly 1 in 18 women. Life expectancy at birth still swung wildly between 25 and 40, depending on where you lived. Here is the deadly idea. In the 1700s, more and more babies were not breastfed at all. The practice was called dry nursing, raising a baby entirely on Papian animal milk from a bottle or a spoon, with no breast milk whatsoever. In an age with no clean water, no refrigeration, and no idea that milk teemed with bacteria, dry nursing was close to a death sentence. The babies fed this way died in enormous numbers. Those who were breastfed by their mother or a wet nurse did far better. The scale of the Foundling Hospital tragedy is hard to take in. Desperate mothers, unable to feed another mouth, left their babies at the gates of these grand charitable institutions, sometimes with a scrap of ribbon or a written note so the child might one day be found again. Inside, the babies were lined up in rows, fed by overworked staff or with pap from grubby vessels, and disease swept through the wards. In some of these homes, of every 10 babies taken in, only 1 or 2 lived to grow up. A place built to save abandoned children became, in practice, a place where they went to die. Meanwhile, in the birthing room, a new danger was arriving disguised as help. The rise of the male doctor, the man midwife, brought new instruments and new confidence, but also dirty hands moving from one sickbed to the next, spreading the deadly childbed fever that killed mothers in their thousands. It would take another 100 years before anyone realized the doctors themselves were carrying the infection. In this strange century, progress often arrived, holding hands with death. Babies were swaddled, then dressed in cloth clouts. Births were still mostly managed by midwives, but a new figure was appearing, the man midwife, an early male doctor of childbirth. Babies were baptized and named within days to weeks. Families were large, 6 or 7 children, because so many were expected to die. The number one killers were diarrhea, smallpox, and the convulsions and fevers that no one understood. The dangerous practice that defined the age was the Foundling Hospital and dry nursing, well-meaning attempts to save babies that often killed them faster. But the breakthrough was real and historic. In this century, a country doctor named Edward Jenner proved that a vaccine could protect against smallpox, one of the great child killers. For the first time in human history, We had a way to stop a disease before it struck. We are going to the 1800s and the dirtiest, deadliest cities the world had ever seen. The 1800s, the Victorian age, gave us railways, factories, and gaslight. It also created something new and terrible for babies, the industrial city, and it nearly killed a generation of them. The Victorian era is a tale of two worlds. In the comfortable countryside, perhaps 85% of babies survive their first year. But in the crowded, filthy slums of the new industrial cities, the death rate was monstrous, with a quarter or more of all babies dying before they were 1. Mothers were finally a little safer, surviving around 99 times in 100, with the rate improving toward the end of the century. Yet in the cities, the average life expectancy at birth could crash to just 25 or 30 years because so many infants died. Food was at the dark heart of the Victorian baby crisis. Mothers breastfed, but more and more working women turned to cow's milk and to the new glass feeding bottles. These bottles, with their long rubber tubes that could never be cleaned, became known later as murder bottles because they bred bacteria perfectly, and the cow's milk itself was often filthy, watered down, and swarming with germs. The result was summer diarrhea, a seasonal wave of fatal gut infections that swept away city babies by the 1,000 every hot season. It was the #1 killer of the age. This era did give us the nappy we would recognise, a square of terry toweling cloth folded and held with the newly invented safety pin from the 1840s. Babies slept in cots and cradles, and a new invention rolled onto the streets, the pram. But the Victorians also gave us one of the most chilling practices in the history of childhood. Opium. Exhausted, overworked mothers and baby minders quieted crying. Hungry, sick infants with opium-based soothing syrups, sold openly under cheerful names like Godfrey's Cordial and Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. These syrups sedated babies, suppressed their appetite, and in countless cases quietly killed them. It was called the poor child's nurse, and it was a tragedy hiding in plain sight. Picture a single room in an industrial city, a mother who must be at the factory by dawn, and a baby she cannot feed or watch. She has two terrible choices. She can leave the baby with a baby farmer, a woman paid a few coins to mind a dozen infants at once, where neglect and a quieting dose of opium meant many never came home. Or she can dose the baby herself, a spoonful of soothing syrup to keep it calm and silent in the dark room while she works, never quite knowing if today's dose is the one that stops its breathing. These were not cruel parents. They were trapped people in an impossible world, doing what everyone around them did. The city itself was the killer, the crowding, the filthy water, the milk hauled in already turning sour, and the simple fact that there was no safe way to feed a baby whose mother had to work. The Victorian age built astonishing wealth and machinery on a foundation that included its own dead children. It is the sharpest reminder in our whole story that a society can be advanced and deadly to its babies at the very same time. And yet, this is also the century where the tide finally began to turn. Because in the 1840s, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that if birth attendants simply washed their hands, mothers stopped dying of childbed fever. The germ theory of disease was being born. For the first time, humanity began to understand the invisible enemy that had been killing its babies for 200,000 years. We are going to the early 1900s, where that knowledge starts to save lives on a massive scale. In the first decades of the 20th century, for the first time in the entire history of our species, the Great Wall of baby death finally began to crumble. The change was dramatic. Infant survival in the first year climbed toward 85 or even 90% in the Western world. The number that had sat near 1 in 4 dying for thousands of years was at last falling fast. Mothers were safer too, surviving childbirth around 99.3 times in 100, and life expectancy in the West rose to around 45 or 50 years, no longer crushed by the weight of dead infants. What changed? Above all, clean milk. The discovery that heating milk, pasteurizing it, killed the bacteria that caused summer diarrhea was a turning point. Cities opened milk depots and infant welfare clinics that handed out safe pasteurized milk, and taught mothers how to feed their babies. Babies still drank breast milk where possible, but now also pasteurized cow's milk and evaporated milk that was far safer than before. The deadly murder bottle began to disappear. Babies wore cloth nappies fastened with pins, often with rubber pants over the top, a brand new idea. They slept in cots and were wheeled out in prams, and there was a fashion for fresh air, putting babies outside to sleep in the cold. Birth was still often at home with a midwife, but hospital births were slowly rising. Babies were named and officially registered at or near birth, a sign of a world where a newborn was now expected to live. Family sizes were shrinking down to 3 or 4 children, partly because parents could finally trust that their babies would survive. The number one killers were still gut infections and pneumonia, but they were in retreat. The defining idea of the age was public health itself, the radical notion that a society could organize to keep its babies alive, with clean milk, clinics, and education. We are going to the middle of the 20th century, the moment formula and medicine truly took over. By the 1950s and 60s in the wealthy world, surviving babyhood went from a gamble to a near certainty, and the way babies were fed was transformed forever. The numbers would have seemed like a miracle to any earlier human. Around 96 to 98% of babies in the developed world now survived their first year. Mothers survived childbirth more than 99.9 times in 100, thanks to antibiotics, blood transfusions, and hospital care. Life expectancy leapt to around 68 or 70 years. The chain of death that had defined human life for 200,000 years was, in rich countries, almost broken. And this is the moment our whole story has been building toward, because this is when formula truly won. Commercial baby formula, manufactured, fortified, and marketed hard as the modern, scientific, even superior way to feed a baby, swept through the Western world. Breastfeeding rates collapsed as mothers were told the bottle was better. For the first time in human history, vast numbers of babies were raised with no breast milk at all, and because the formula was now clean and the water was now safe, they survived. The thing that had been a death sentence in the 1700s, raising a baby without the breast, had finally been made safe by science. It is worth pausing on how fast this happened. A woman giving birth in the 1950s had a grandmother who had buried children as a normal part of life, who had nursed her babies for years because there was no safe alternative, who had pinned cloth and boiled water and prayed. And now that same grandmother watched her granddaughter scoop powder into a sterilized bottle, hand it to a baby that would almost certainly live, and go back to work. In just 2 or 3 generations, humanity erased a danger that had stalked every family since the beginning of time. There was a cost. In the rush to embrace the modern bottle, much of the ancient knowledge of breastfeeding was lost, and it would take decades for the world to rediscover that breast milk, where a mother can give it, is still something science cannot fully match. But for the very first time, a baby did not need it to survive. The choice itself, breast or bottle, was a luxury that almost no human in history had ever been able to afford. Babies wore cloth nappies and pins until the disposable nappy arrived in the 1960s and changed parenting forever. They slept in their own cots, often in their own rooms, in the new era of strict routines and sleep training. Birth had moved firmly into the hospital, managed by doctors. Babies were named before they were even born. Families settled at 2 or 3 children. With vaccines wiping out the diseases that once slaughtered children, and antibiotics curing infections in days, the number one threats were now things like premature birth and conditions present from birth, not the old plagues of dirty milk and water. The breakthroughs came all at once: antibiotics, childhood vaccines, safe commercial formula, and the disposable nappy. We arrive at last, in the present day. Here we are, in your lifetime, in the safest moment to be born in the entire history of the human race. The numbers are almost unbelievable next to everything that came before. In the developed world, more than 99.5% of babies survive their first year. A mother's chance of dying in childbirth is now around 1 in 10,000, where it was once 1 in 100 per birth. Life expectancy stretches past 80. The thing that killed 1 in 4 babies for thousands of years has, in much of the world, been reduced to a rare tragedy, rather than a routine fact of life. Babies today are fed on breast milk, modern formula, or both, with solid food introduced from around 6 months, and the World Health Organization recommending breastfeeding alongside it up to 2 years or beyond. They wear disposable nappies, changed in seconds and thrown away. They are born in hospitals with doctors and midwives monitored every step of the way, and the sickest and smallest are saved in intensive care units that can keep a baby born months too early alive. A baby gets sick, of course, a few colds a year, the odd fever. But these are inconveniences now, not death sentences. Babies are named before they arrive, their rooms decorated, their names announced to the world, because we simply expect them to live. Families have shrunk to 1 or 2 children, for the first time not to outrun death, but by choice. Babies sleep safely on their backs in their own cots, ride in car seats and prams, and the great debates of modern parenting are about screen time and sleep schedules, not survival. The breakthroughs that built this safe world are stacked on top of each other across the centuries. Clean water, pasteurized milk, vaccines, antibiotics, safe formula, intensive care, the simple, world-changing discovery to lay a baby on its back to sleep. Every one of them bought with the lives of countless babies who came before, which brings us back to you. Think about the journey we have just taken. An Ice Age baby wrapped in moss and skin, nursed for 4 years by the fire, a Roman newborn waiting 8 days to be given a name, a medieval baby baptized in a panic before it could die, a Victorian infant quieted with opium in a filthy city, and finally a modern baby, sleeping safely in a warm room with a clean bottle waiting. For almost the whole of that story, being a baby meant a 1 in 4 chance of never seeing your first birthday and a coin flip on reaching the age of 5. Mothers prepared to die to give birth. Parents held back their love and even a name until they were sure the child would live. That was not a dark age. That was simply normal for thousands and thousands of years. And yet, here you are. Stop and really feel what that means. Every single one of your direct ancestors, going back 200,000 years, was a baby who beat those odds. Not one of them died in the cradle. Not one. Through the cold, the disease, the dirty milk, the dangerous weaning, the opium, the plagues, the unbroken chain of survival ran all the way down through 10,000 generations and ended in you. The soft, safe, ordinary miracle of a baby that simply lives is the rarest thing in human history, and we have had it for less than a single lifetime. The next time you see a baby sleeping peacefully or a warm bottle on a kitchen counter, remember the moss, the wet nurses, the swaddling bands, and that 1 in 4 who did not make it. You are the lucky end of the longest, most fragile survival story ever told. If this journey moved you, stay with me. There are more forgotten corners of our history waiting, and I would love to show you the next one.